So I'm talking now with Gary Lonesborough, author of young adult novel The Boy from the Mish. In this book, 17-year-old Jackson is in the summer before his final year of school, and he's working through who he is and what he wants. When his auntie and cousins come to stay, they bring along Thomas with them. Thomas, who's been in juvie, Thomas, who interests Jackson very much. Ultimately, this is a very funny and moving and romantic book. And I think the fact that they're both young men and the fact that they're both Aboriginal shouldn't matter, but it absolutely does. And what I love about this book is its beautiful representation, but also I mostly love the romance. And Gary, thank you so much for chatting with me today. And I wanted to ask you sort of what first prompted you to write Jackson's story.
It's a funny question. So I guess, I'd written this short film script way back in my film school days, like 2015. It was basically, a story about this. It was this secret romance between these two Aboriginal boys. And it was basically the last night in their relationship before one of them moves away. So I wrote that short script and then just shelved it for a few years. Then I read Simon vs. Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertelli. And that really, sort of spurred, the creative energy and also the desire to seek out, a book that was like Simon vs. Homo Sapiens Agenda, but that had Aboriginal characters. So, did a little bit of research trying to find another, young adult novel that had an Aboriginal protagonist who was also a queer person, which proved to be difficult and near impossible to find. So it was just like a flick of the switch. I remember that I had this script. I read the script again a couple of times and realized that there was a bigger sort of story there that I could explore. And yeah, just started writing and without any real plan or expectation that I would finish, a novel. And yeah, I punched out that first draft in, just over a month, I think.
Yeah, Gary, I'll stop you there. I heard that you only took a month to write this first draft, and I'm incredibly jealous. So I hope that continues for you. I mean, I know the first draft is always just that, a draft, and there's a lot of work to be done afterwards. But that's really exciting.
Yeah, like I'd punch it. I could never. No one will ever see that draft. It'll never see the light of day. But yeah, I had this this creative burst that I just needed to get this story out. Basically, I was working part-time at the time, so I had days off. I had, any time I wasn't working or spending time with friends or, doing housework, I was writing basically. And yeah, it was in January of, I think, 2018? No, I don't know. I can't even remember. But it was that January. So I remember it was really hot and I was just sitting in my room, typing away in a singlet with the fan on full blast and just sweating like the whole time. But yeah, I just had this story bursting out of me, and obviously it evolved and changed a lot throughout the revising and editing, and became a much better story than it originally was. But yeah, that's how it started.
You can feel that hot summer that Jackson and Thomas are experiencing. So obviously really lent itself to your writing as well. And what I loved were not just these two main characters. It was so beautifully written, but the world that you've created with all the different family members. Jackson's mother is a fantastic character. All his mates and the people in the town. Did you come to that slowly, or did the world sort of appear quite quickly?
Yeah, once I knew I was expanding off that short film script, and even from that script, the first draft of The Boy from the Mish, it's a completely different story, different characters. But yeah, like once I just started writing, my parents would say, just dive right in and just start, letting the words hit the page. Once I started moving along in the story, I realized I was in this small Aboriginal village, and I knew I wanted it to be coastal, wanted it to be country, rural area. Uh, and yeah, like the the setting and the scenery and the location, it's all very much inspired by places I grew up around and places I'd been to as a kid and as a teenager. So I really tried to tap into that uh, nostalgic feeling when I was, writing those scenes where they're walking through the bush or hanging out at the lake or just walking through the campsites with all the tourists. Uh, yeah, I really wanted to capture how it felt as a teenager to be experiencing all those places and walking barefoot on the sand or on the grass through town. Uh, but yeah, so all the places in the book were very much inspired by places I'd been. I grew up in Bega on the far south coast, New South Wales. So uh, yeah, I know a lot of people down that way would definitely be able to recognize a few inspirations in the book. But uh, what I love about taking inspiration from places and or setting the story in a real place is that you can mess with the geography. You can paint it however you want to fit the story. So really, what I was doing is just taking memories and experiences and places I loved and reshaping them for the book.
Yeah, it sounds like a really smart way to begin and gives that real sort of sense of place to the work. And I don't know if your background, you say you have a background in film, and it was really visual writing. Did you use some of that like cinematic brain as you're writing?
Yeah, I think uh, doing screenplay writing for 2 3 years. There's just more tools for the writer's toolkit because when you're writing scripts, you have to be very visual. You have to focus on emotion, but at the same time, you're telling a story on screen. So uh, yeah, you have to write very visually. You have to think very visually. Uh, so yeah, I think that definitely helped. My experiences writing scripts definitely helped when I was writing the book. Because I guess it's pretty simple advice, but to use the five senses when you're describing a place or a location. Uh, yeah, I was just doing that really.
And dialogue too, I suppose. When you're writing a film script, often you've got the little scene descriptions, but relying so heavily on the spoken word as well.
Yes, I always feel like dialogue is a weakness of mine. I don't think I'm really good at it. Uh, it's through the editing, your dialogue becomes better, but yeah, I it's always hard to get dialogue right. I find what helps me is I'll speak the words out myself that I'd written. And usually, 9 times out of 10, the first time I do that, it doesn't sound right, so I'll change it. Uh, but yeah, like using my own, just sounding out the sentences, sounding out the lines myself. That's how I write the dialogue in the end. But yeah, like dialogue is one of my weak points. I think in the early process of the writing of the drafting. So yeah, I'm very thankful for editing and revision. I think those two things have helped make my dialogue better.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, I think the conversations across the board were wonderful, and I really particularly love the scenes where Jackson and Thomas speaking together. I thought, yeah, dialogue was beautiful.
And like with the book, I wanted to be I wanted to be a lot about the things that they weren't saying. Uh, so I wanted there to be all these, sentences that were just in the air, that weren't actually coming out of the mouths. So I had a lot of fun, teasing out certain moments and situations, or being, deliberately ambiguous about certain things. Yeah, I just think it's really fun to write that way and really fun to read as well.
Yeah. While reading The Boy from the Mish, it's not obviously just about this romance that's between the two main characters. You've got this beautiful story of family, and Jackson's sort of troubles with his friends and his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend, and the rich white kids in the campsite. Um, but at the heart of it, I felt like this book was such a joyful romance, And I wondered if that was your main goal with the book as well.
Yeah, definitely. The romance was the first. That was the story to begin with. It was just the love story. Everything else came later. Yeah, I guess, going back to how I felt at the end of reading Simon vs. Homo sapiens Agenda, I just wanted to write a really, really cute, really lovely love story between these two Aboriginal gay teenagers. That was my main focus, and that was the story when I first started writing. But yeah, through the whole writing process, you realize that you have to build your world, and I realized that through Jackson, I could explore a lot more things, like racism and the racial divide between the Aboriginal community Jackson lives on and the town that's nearby, white people in it. With the police, the relationship with the police, and yeah, through Thomas, I realized I could. So Thomas really shapeshifted a lot through the process. He changed a lot, but ultimately, I ended on, I was becoming very passionate about, the incarceration rates of Indigenous youth in the country at the time, and I was spending a lot of time through work in the juvenile justice centres with these Aboriginal kids, a lot of whom had been in out of home care or foster care or kinship care, come from broken homes, childhood traumas, all those sort of things. So I was becoming very passionate about those things when I was writing it, and yeah, just Thomas was a way for me to explore those things as well. But yeah, it all started with the love story, and then the branches grew from there.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And Thomas is such an interesting character, and him with his interest in graphic novels and drawing and art, and Jackson also with his interest in art and story. It was just also so joyful and wonderful to see them sort of explore and like take risks with their creativity. I wondered if you have had a chance to hear from any readers since the book's come out. I know lockdown's probably made it hard to do visits and things, but I imagine there'll be readers who respond very strongly to your story.
Yeah, look, I've definitely, I was lucky enough, between COVID lockdowns to be able to do Sydney Writers Festival and Brisbane Writers Festival, and meet during the schools programs with the Sydney Writers Festival. You're talking to all those kids, and a lot of them asking really insightful, intelligent questions that you didn't expect, and very different questions than I'd get from an adult interviewer. But feedback from readers, I've definitely received a lot of messages and emails via my website, just the people reaching out to let me know that they've loved the book. Yeah, it is a shame that I haven't had the chance to do a lot of in-person events. I did do a queer YA book club meeting at Glee Books in Glebe here in Sydney, and it was basically just me and like, I don't know, 6 or 7 queer teenagers just sitting around talking about the book. They asked me if I could just write a short novella showing Thomas and Jackson in love, with no problems, no complications, just showing them being in love. Maybe I will. And I've definitely received a lot of messages and emails from older gay men who have come across the book and read it, and really have been able to connect with something in there, something that they needed when they were a teenager, or something they wish they had, something they could relate to in the characters, and love the book. So the feedback's been, in terms of age, very very wide range, and I'm glad older adults. I think the oldest person that reached out to me was in their early 70s. Yeah, I love that it's reaching readers of all ages and not just my target audience. But yeah, also happy that it's reaching the target audience as well.
Of course. And I think the fact that you're hearing from these older readers just goes to show that this is something that's been missing from our bookshelves. And I know that a huge part of the joy was sort of me reading this beautiful romance that just made me feel like a teenager again. It was like that like awkward, beautiful first steps of a romance, and just feeling so pleased to know that young gay men will read this and be able to see themselves in the story. It just felt like such an amazing celebration. With writing Jackson's family, was there anything that you wanted to get across there? Was that like an intentional construction of his family, him without his dad, and the scenes where Jackson visits with the men of the community? That was a really interesting part of the story for me. How did you approach those?
I don't think I really planned anything. uh, I know it's going to sound cliche as hell, but it really felt like Jackson when it felt like Jackson just walked into the room and like I knew who he was. I knew his family. I knew he had a mum and a little brother. The dad wasn't really in the picture. So he's sort of like in a lot of ways like I was, the eldest sibling, acting as like a third parent to the younger ones. And so I knew he would take on that leadership role with the visiting cousins. Yeah, it just all really came together organically, I think. I think the thing didn't really realize I was missing was, the story with Jackson's mum and his auntie and the painting that they were working on. So that didn't come till much later. And I don't know, once it came in, it was perfect, and it all just fit perfectly, and yeah, very organically. Yeah, really, all I was trying to do was, paint an authentic picture of an Aboriginal family. I guess sad reality is that a lot of Aboriginal kids only really get to grow up with one strong parent. And yeah, I think that just really adds to Jackson's character and his emotional intelligence, his maturity. That's time and space where he's about to move into adulthood.
Absolutely. Like to trust the process. Like that's what writing is, isn't it? That you come with this idea, and then over time through revision and conversations with maybe critique partners or your editor, like the story finds its way. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, I'm so thankful for my editor. I think it was her suggestion to maybe explore a subplot with the mom and the auntie. And once I started looking at it, it just came, just a little there. So I'm very thankful for editing and the it's a whole it's a whole different approach in the whole writing process. I really don't even know what I love more, the drafting or the editing, but yeah, I just love the the changing and making it that stage in the process where you're shaping it into a book. Yeah, I just love that.
And in terms of like finding creativity and inspiration for writing, how does that sort of generally come to you? I guess we have talked about that a little bit, but I'm really interested to know. I know that my creativity has been kind of affected over the past year or so, and just wondered if your process has changed at all.
I've tried to think about this and really analyze how I got that creative burst. When I started drafting my first draft, and it's gonna sound really weird, but I know at the time I was feeling incredibly lonely. I was feeling very unhappy with, I guess, where my life was at the time. So I think the inspiration and the creative burst came from that dark place I was in at the time. It was like I guess like a balloon that was rising in the air, and I just sort of grabbed onto the rope. And that was the book. Really got me out of it. But these days, I find that going for a walk definitely helps with the creativity. Yeah, I guess I just find inspiration with everything. I like to think of everything that happens in my daily life. Everything negative or positive. It's all potential writing material. So yeah, I guess that's just how I'm approaching it. Try to take inspiration from everything, think of everything as writing material, and it's also important to make time in your life for other things. Uh, so if you're just spending your whole time focusing on a project, I guess uh, I find that doesn't really work for me if I don't have other things happening in my life at the time. Uh, that being said, I would love to just be a full-time writer and not have to work a job, but yeah, I don't know.
And I know that also reading really helps me get ideas. And I wondered if you have been reading anything interesting lately.
Yeah, I'm currently reading a short story collection called Dear Ibis, um, by my close friend, Kate Liston Mills. Um, I think it was published by Spineless Wonders, if I remember correctly. But it's a small book, small print run with a small publisher. But yeah, Kate's a friend, so reading that right now, and it is a gem, I must say. It's really beautiful. Um, she's a very, very talented writer. She writes very poetically, and her words are very. I feel like like the word choice that she uses is very particular and specific. Whereas if I'm writing, I'm just throwing a bunch of sentences in to explain something or describe something. Whereas if you read Kate's writing, it really feels like everything's there for a reason. Yeah, I don't know how else to explain it.
That sounds
But yeah,
amazing.
that's what I'm reading right now.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I will just mention this episode is being supported by Brunswick Bound, which is an independent bookshop in Brunswick in the inner north of Melbourne. They're a small but mighty shop with really excellently curated collection. You can follow the link in the description to buy Gary's book and have a little virtual visit in this store.
Hi, I'm Ellen and I'm the manager of Brunswick Bound, and I wanted to talk to you today about our Pay It Forward voucher wall. So these vouchers are donated by people in our community. They're for lots of different values and they can be used for anything in the shop at all. So of course books, but also puzzles, games, stationery, anything that we sell. We decided to bring this program into our shop because we understand that books are a luxury item and that not everybody has access to books, but we think that everybody should have access to books. So if you would like to use a Pay It Forward voucher or buy a Pay It Forward voucher, you can get in touch with us either via email or calling the shop, and there are heaps of them here for you to use, so feel free to anytime you need to.